Hey guys, welcome back to another Realm of the Mad God video, and this video is going to be my first ever tier list video. I've never made one, even while I was still playing MapleStory or the like. I just saw the tier list fad as sort of a little too overrated or kind of pointless, which is why I never really made one, but I wanted to do one just because I figured it could be a good experience, maybe something I want to do in the future. And so for the first tier list video I guess we're talking about, it's going to be the dungeons of Realm of the Mad God. This is also going to be an unscripted commentary, so if it does sound very rambly, or if I end up having to stutter or cut out a lot of stuff, I do apologize. But yeah, so here we are on Tier List Maker as usual. That's where everyone has their own tier list, and I'm gonna get started. I have a section here called No Opinion, mostly just because a lot of these dungeons are either gimmick dungeons that you don't really go into for the sake of getting loot or something of actual importance. A lot of these are vanity dungeons like the Santa's Workshop or Beach Zone, Battle for the Nexus. I know you could get some stuff here. Wait, is this Battle for Nexus or is this Mad God Mayhem? I don't remember. But yeah, Machine as well, not really, there's no point to it. However, I believe the Alien Portals, I forget, this is I think Forax. I think this is Untaris, this is Malogia, I forget what the yellow one is, but I don't do them enough to be able to form an opinion over them, which is why I have them in the no opinion section. I don't know what dungeon this is. Is this supposed to be like the heroic Snake Pit or heroic Forbidden Jungle? I'm not sure, but I don't think I've ever been in one of these. And of course the heroic Demon Abyss and Undead Lair, and the Rainbow Portal. So all of these I'm not going to give a rating for just because they have no functional purpose to them, or I haven't done them enough. And I do plan to do the alien ones in the future, I hope there's another alien event soon, but we're just going to cover over all the non-event main dungeons, and we'll see how it goes. I guess we'll go left to right. These aren't ordered, so like Pirate Cave I expect it to be over here. So I think, you know what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go left to right, and we'll see how that goes. And if it gets too long, I'll divide it up into two parts. So let's get started with Pirate Cave. I'm going to put that in D, just because not necessarily rating it by difficulty or by the value of drops that you can get from that dungeon. It's just my own opinions on it. Pirate Cave, it's a good starting dungeon, and therefore it is meant to be very easy and kind of pointless, and it's just to help get you sink your teeth into the game and to figure out exactly how the main gameplay works in Realm. So I'm gonna leave it at D, not because I don't like it, but just because that's what it's meant to serve, right? It's just supposed to be a regular beginner's dungeon. Puppet Master Theater, I enjoy quite a bit, so I'm going to put it in a B tier. The main thing about it that I enjoy is that it has a challenge to it that can easily be circumvented with patience, and in a bullet hell game like Realm of the Mad God, it's of a pretty fitting difficulty for you to decide is it safe to rush, because in most other dungeons, especially in the Godlands, you can just mindlessly rush through it, right? But it's much more dangerous to rush a Puppet Master Theater because you have to go for the destructible walls who do have a lot of HP, and then the puppets can actually do some fairly significant damage. And since you're in an enclosed area, you'll be dealing with maybe 10 to sometimes even 15 puppets in a single room. So regardless of what class you're playing, this is a fairly difficult dungeon. And so I want to keep it around B tier. I enjoy it quite a bit. I don't go into them as much as I used to because my main source of attack is now just Lost Halls. But back when I was still trying to get my first couple 8/8s, I loved this dungeon just because it was hard, but not in a way that was kind of stifling or boring like Demon Abyss. Forest Maze, this is Forest Maze. Okay, so I guess we'll go for Forest Maze. Also a D tier dungeon. I never particularly liked this dungeon. I just felt like it was kind of pointless. It was even more pointless than Pirate Cave, because I don't know, it's just the enemies that drop Forest Maze and then what Forest Maze is actually supposed to do. It was just really annoying having to deal with all these random status effects that you would go into. And then I feel like the dungeon in particular was just not designed too properly. It carries over a little bit into Woodland Labyrinth, which is kind of what I'm going to be talking about later. But I get that theme for it, when you're in a jungle or a maze or a forest or something like that, there's bound to be a lot of poisonous plants or ravenous animals and dangerous insects and stuff like that. So I get the premise behind it, but from a design standpoint in terms of gameplay, I just don't think it was very well executed on. It just doesn't feel fun to go through, Woodland Labyrinth, I'm gonna put down in C tier. Woodland is probably my least favorite dungeon of the 3 epic dungeons, because of the fact that it just has a bunch of status effects, and it's there only because of the fact that it's supposed to be like, you know, a forest with a lot of poisonous plants and ravenous animals and dangerous insects and stuff like that. The Megamoth is arguably the easiest of the 3 to take out. No, that's a lie actually. The Megamoth is the second one because obviously John Bilgewater is the easiest one of the 3. But to get there, you usually just sit in the spawn and wait for someone who's daring enough to go and find the boss. But overall, to get to that boss, it just is annoying because I sometimes rush myself, and half the time, it feels like all the obstacles that are planted in front of you before you get to the boss, you know, as you go through the corridors, the rooms, a lot of the enemies there are just there to slow you down or to get you confused or basically impede your progress. And there are those like turrets that shoot out little, like, I don't know what they're supposed to shoot out, that are there just purely to make it so that you can't just like stop and catch your breath. It's just overall a really annoying dungeon. It does have good drops. I very much like the Leaf Bow and the Wakizashi of Eastern Winds. I just find it to be really frustrating to go through by yourself, and it's a lot easier to go through in a party, of course. All 3 epic dungeons are. From my own perspective, I would much rather go into like a D-Docs or a C-Depths, just because C-Depths is more straightforward to go through, and D-Docs is just, you know, finding the tea room is nice. It's a much easier tea room to find than, you know, Woodland Labyrinth. Not many people go for the tea room in Woodlab unless like someone's actively trying to look for one and they just so happen to stumble upon it. Undead Lair, put on B tier. Same with Puppet Master Theater. Undead Lair, I like the sort of transition of difficulty because it's the dungeon that's obviously harder than Snake Pit. It's obviously harder than the likes of Forbidden Jungle and stuff, but it's not necessarily to the point where you can't go through it unless you have a decent amount of experience in knowing what can or can't kill you. I've died quite a bit in Undead Lairs when I first started out, but I like the yield of items that it gives in terms of, obviously they drop a lot of purple bags, and the boss Octavius could give you the very powerful Doom Bow, but also the dungeon design as a whole. It's not too labyrinth-like to the point where you're getting caught in dead ends non-stop. If you travel in the general direction of the boss, you'll reach him, right? It's not like some other dungeons where the route to the boss is just a completely roundabout and meandering, like, you know, avenue to get to them. Undead Lair, usually just travel in the general direction. Like if the boss is northeast of you, then travel northeast and eventually you'll get there. So I like it. It's a very good mid-level dungeon. I wouldn't put it as high as Puppet Master Theater just because I don't think the rewards are as good. I do like the Harlequin armor and Dancing Swords Prism. Or, no, is it the Dancing Sword? Yeah, it's the Dancing Swords Prism. As well as attack pots, are more valuable. Snake Pit, I'll put above in C tier. I know that they give you the new, like the Snake Charmer loot, and I also do enjoy the ease of access with the Snake Pit. You just go through, and it has kind of the same premise as the Puppet Master Theater, where you go through destructible walls and there are like enclosed rooms. But I just think that it's a very unremarkable dungeon because while speed potions are nice, that's all you get. The white bag drops from Cithino is not that valuable, and like I would only go into it if I need to complete Tunnel Rat or if I would want to, like if I just need 1 or 2 speed to max. But overall, a Snake Pit isn't really the dungeon I would go for over a UDL or a Demon Abyss, just because the potential loot you can get is worse in my opinion than the actual speed potion. I don't care for Wand of Bulwark, and the Snake Charmer, I mean, whatever, it's a speedy loot basically, and not many people like speedy just because sometimes they could actually work against you. Mad Lab. I think Mad Lab I'll put in B tier because I actually do like how the Mad Lab employs the use of memorable set pieces in that each room you recognize, right? It's one of those like procedurally generated dungeons that has predetermined rooms, and I enjoy the fact that there are a few like puzzles in between that you can go through. There might be that the toxic like corrosive water route that you have to walk through, or like the graded area that you have to make sure you can get through safely while things are flying at you and confusing you. Enemies are respectably dangerous, but easy to avoid if you just like, you know, ignore them and run right through them. And while they do employ a lot of crowd control that can be very annoying, especially confusion, it's not as oppressive as the likes of a, you know, Woodland Labyrinth because it doesn't necessarily impede your progress since the crowd control stems directly from the enemies and you can outrun them easily. And I like the fact that Mad Lab can drop multiple drops from both the horrific abomination thingamadoohickey guy and Dr. Terrible. Not only that, but the Conducting Wand and Scepter Fulmination are 2 of my favorite white bags in the game. and he can drop Wisdom and Defense. So I find myself going through these more frequently, but I wouldn't really go through them alone. If like during, let's say, the Mad Lab event they had a while back, I remember farming a bunch of them, but if I see one in Godlands, I might pass it up and perhaps go for something else. But I still think it's a very good dungeon. I loved beating this dungeon for the first time when I did. This was one of my most challenging dungeons to go through, even harder than Demon Abyss, and so it has a good spot in my heart. Crawling Depths, I will put it in A tier. It's a very straightforward dungeon in, being the remake of the Spider Den, in that it has a straight shot all the way through. The spiders can be extremely dangerous, but if you know how to run through them, or if you can basically use cover fire and kill them quickly, then you can make it through the dungeon without any problem. The boss fight with Son of Arachna, I actually think is kind of unique, because I think he's one of the few, outside of maybe Davy Jones and other bosses, where you have to destroy something else before you attack the boss. I think that's a cool design mechanic, and he does drop pretty good loot. Not to mention the treasure room can yield an extremely large amount of potions if you manage to stumble across one. Because the dungeon is just a straightforward route, one shot all the way through the dungeon, the treasure room is not always there. But if you do come across one, you can get way more chances for drops than if you would a Woodlab or a Dead Dedox. Not only that, but the Symbiotic Ripper, I believe you can get from the ST set. I think, what else is it? The Rags of the Host? Was it the Host or was it the Poison? No, the Poison and the Ring comes from the Parasite Chamber. I think the Rags and the Ripper comes from Sea Depths. And then also the Dokuno Cannon. It's not as good as it used to be, but it is still a highly sought after katana, I think, from most ninjas and samurais. I haven't gotten one yet, actually. It still continues to evade me. But I do also enjoy the fact that you can get some decent potions from the Sea Depths. You can get a mana, which do not drop from Dedox or Woodland. And also the egg sacs can drop 4 of the 6 rainbow potions, which is really, really nice. So honestly, I like it. The boss is super easy if you take out all 4 of the egg sacs. But otherwise, if you don't, it'll be quite difficult. So this is a good example of a boss where if you don't know how the boss works, you will get utterly annihilated. And if you know how the boss works, it becomes pretty easy. I think this is Secluded Thicket, right? Yeah. Okay, so the only reason I go into a thicket is because I want the Hirajotene. The Raishin Disciple set is the only incentive people have to go into this dungeon. The bosses are kind of... Okay, so Tezcatlipoca, I think his boss fight is decent, right? I actually love Eldorado's design in terms of his summoning those I believe it's inspired off of the Aztec people or whatever. Those natives or those... I don't know what this was, tribesmen, there you go. I actually like that boss fight quite a bit. But Zolotl, his boss fight is just so pointlessly annoying. And he doesn't even drop anything good. Neither does Eldorado. In fact, all 3 of the Forbidden Jungle Whites kind of suck. And people only go for the Hirajotene and perhaps the Chakram and maybe the Reikoku. So for me, I just only go into the thicket for the first boss. And then if the first boss doesn't drop anything, I just leave. It could yield some decent drops, but it's not a dungeon that you would really want to go into because the risk-reward ratio of because you can easily die in a thicket. It's quite dangerous if you're not sure what to do in the fight. And if you're not very good at dodging patterns or understanding where the safe spots are or the dangerous areas are, then you just should not go into this dungeon. I think it's too difficult for how unrewarding it is, and therefore I put it in C tier. It's below Woodland because Woodland still gives you some pretty decent white bags, but Secluded Thicket doesn't. Demon Abyss, I'm gonna put... actually I'll put here. So before it dropped both a guaranteed defense and vitality potion, which made it worthwhile given that this dungeon is the most threatening Godlands dungeon, I think, to this day. Not because of how hard it is, but just because of how many things can hurt you in that dungeon. Not to mention the demons and the brutes, they chase you all around, and if you try to rush, you have to be sure you can take them out quickly. Otherwise, if you hit a dead end, you're going to be facing down a wall of 7,000 damage. Even for melee classes, if you don't have a good pet, this dungeon can be quite tedious, and it kind of has the same issue as Thicket, where the drops that come from the dungeon are just not as rewarding as the amount of risk you have to take to go through them. I don't think the Molten Mystic set is worth it that much because, I should have mentioned that the Hollow King Necromancer set is also what makes Undead Lair pretty valuable. And the Acidified Assassin is why I put the Snake Pit a little higher than Woodland and Demon Abyss, because those ST sets are actually quite good. but the Molten Mystic or whatever is not that great to begin with. And while the Coveted Draw Demon Blade is still one of my favorite sprites of all time, Demon Blade is terrible. It has the highest damage output of any weapon in the game, I think, in terms of DPS, but you have to stand point blank on enemies, which usually entails death. I don't care if you have an Oreo or a Crystal Shield. It is just not practical to use anymore. It's cool, but it's just Demon Abyss has kind of been falling off in terms of its value for a while now. I still think it's better than the Thicket because at least you can pick up some decent potions, but otherwise I wouldn't put it any higher than that. Crystal Cavern, A tier. I wouldn't put it S tier because of how tedious it is. I have a love-hate relationship with Fungal. I think it's a really nice dungeon to go through, and I would certainly choose to go through a Fungal Cavern more than Fungal and Crystal Cavern more than a Abyss of Demons, right? Because you can at least get some decent stuff. The white bags are kind of divisive. There are some that are very powerful, like the I'm trying to remember. Well, I know the ST set. The Crystal Kunoichi set is just phenomenal. It's an incredibly powerful set. But everything else, let's see. I'm trying to remember which white bags are actually good and which ones aren't, because there's quite a bit. The main reason why I put Crystal Cavern so high is because for the difficulty to reward ratio, and also because it's a pretty interesting dungeon where you can't necessarily autopilot through it, because if you do, you can get your ass handed to you. But it's a dungeon that rewards, it's actually one of my more favorite dungeons to go through in like a public run. Public Lost Halls, not really, they're starting to fall out of favor for me. Shatters, I mean, they don't happen as often, and I don't go through Shatters as much anymore. My favorite pub dungeon to run through is Fungal Cavern, because it's one of those dungeons where you don't need to be as alert as Lost Halls to the point where you're in constant danger, but you can still put yourself through enough engagement to take on the bosses. And I love the design for how the bosses are actually the easiest part of the dungeon, because you have to go through so much work and effort to take down those pink crystals so you can power the drill. And the Crystal Worm Mother, Father, and Child, along with the actual crystal itself, those boss fights happen relatively quickly. It's not nearly as long as the likes of Marble Colossus and Void Entity or Cultist Hideout. Reason being is because the challenge of that dungeon comes from the dungeon itself, not so much the bosses, which is the opposite in Lost Halls, where the danger is from the bosses and not necessarily the minions. So I'm going to put Fungal Cavern and Crystal Cavern together since they're kind of a joint pair. I just wouldn't put them in S tier because sometimes their dungeons can be a little tedious, and while obviously you don't want to go through dungeons too quickly, it is annoying to have to spend 20 minutes just to go for a mark if I'm trying to complete a Tinker quest chest, so that's why I leave that there. Haunted Cemetery, S tier. I loved this dungeon when I first started playing Realm, and I love it today. They reworked it to give you so many more challenges and so much more loot, and I love the whole wave battle mechanic that they have in the dungeon. This is the only dungeon in the game, I think, that gives you all 6 rainbow potions that isn't a high level dungeon such as a Crystal Cavern or a Cultist Hideout. Not only that, but you have several chances to get loot. Since there are 5 bosses, you have 5 chances for drops. And each of those bosses could drop multiple potions. I have gotten upwards of 8 to 10 potions per cemetery, which is why I like it so much. It's a very rewarding dungeon, regardless of whether you get the white bags or not. In fact, I think the white bags are the least important part of these dungeons, because Plague Poison obviously is not as good as it used to be, if it was ever. Same with Resurrected Warrior's Armor. We don't need it anymore because there are better rings and other armors, along with more people having access to stronger pets. But it still carries a lot of value to it just because of how many potions you can get. And it's a dungeon that I think is really fitting for how, as each room you progress through, it gets harder and harder and harder. And I don't think any other dungeon has a wave battle feature like this, which is why I still think Cemetery is one of my favorite dungeons to go through if I really needed potions. I'm only ranking this S tier because of how it is from a design perspective. I don't really go through Sems much anymore, especially after the whole Sem event, which now I'm burned out by this dungeon. But it is a very rewarding one. It's an easy way to get characters from level 15 or 10 to level 20. The good risk to reward ratio. It has a very good risk to reward ratio. Candyland Hunting Grounds, D. I'm putting it above the Pirate Cave and Forest Maze just because I think it has actual stuff. I hate this dungeon. While yes, you have a chance to get infinite loot, as Hayes puts it quite fittingly, you can also get infinite nothing. and I've gotten more infinite nothing from this than I have gotten actual loot. The only decent drop I got from this dungeon was 1 pixie sword out of like 360 bosses I fought. I got like 2 candy coated armors. But other than that, the drops you get from this dungeon in terms of how much time you have to put into it is just not worth it. I also just don't like how the only way to get into this dungeon is to either kill the candy gnome, which never happened. You'd never really see one on maybe like once every month you might see one. And so therefore you have to buy keys. Before, Candyland Hunting Grounds was a heavily priced dungeon because pots were a lot hard to get. But now you almost never see people going into Candyland because Deca hasn't really updated the drops. They have changed it so now you can bring in up to 65 people, but the dungeon itself just feels more tedious than it does rewarding, so therefore I don't really want to go into that. Lair of Draconis I will put at the bottom of B tier. I certainly think it's a rewarding dungeon, right? And the white bags are decent. Some of them are good, some of them they're okay, right? And you do have chances to get potions from all 5 dungeons. However, I personally liked the previous Lair of Draconis more than the current one. This dungeon is the most tedious dungeon in the game. I would actually put it like bottom of C tier or maybe a high D tier if it wasn't for the fact that I actually have pretty good luck with getting loot from the dungeons and I kind of understand and like the design thematic. But the dungeon gameplay itself is so boring. It's not hard to the point where like you have to be constantly alert to whatever can kill you, like a void or a marble colossus, but you can't turn your brain off in autopilot like you would an abyss of demons or a crawling depths because everything in there can kill you. There's so many things flying towards you that if you don't pay attention, you will die. And there are so many invulnerability phases, so many of these weird conditions that you have to meet, especially for the likes of Limos. I hate Limos so much. Why did he go from being the fastest and easiest dragon to being the longest and most dangerous dragon? All 4 of them have ways to stall for time, including the Ivory Wyvern. The Ivory Wyvern used to be super easy to deal with, and now he takes like at least 5 minutes. Now, before you guys say that dungeons are not meant to be instant, I understand that, but there's a difference between adding difficult mechanics and mechanics that are deliberately intended to stall for time. Do you guys remember the 2-minute survival phase from Marble Colossus? Yeah, that is stalling for time, not a difficult mechanic that you have to overcome. The current one fixes that by encouraging people to push up and take out all the keys, or whatever those marks are supposed to be. The only reason the invulnerability phases are there in LoD is to stall for time. It's not hard. It's just you can straight up sit during Nikao's whole water phase and do nothing. So while I don't think it's the worst dungeon to exist, I think the rework was not very well executed on because all it did was make the dungeon take a lot longer, and they haven't made any changes or adjustments to the loot to make it more, valuable. It's not like the Haunted Cemetery, to where they understand that while, yes, the white bags are not as good as they used to be, to at least push that value elsewhere by giving you just so many rainbow potions to the point where you can get so many pots from one cemetery in the time it takes you to do 10 dungeons. They didn't do the same for LoD. I still love the Water Dragon Silk Robe and the Celestial Blade and the Midnight Star, but otherwise that's the only reason why I go there. I sometimes don't even go through Limos at all. I actually think Limos is the worst boss in the game, by design. So I'm putting it at a low B tier just because there are some things that keep it from falling from grace, but there are other things that prevent it from being higher up. Parasite Chambers. I'll put it A tier. It is annoying in terms of obviously the Nightmare Colony could be really, really annoying to deal with if you don't have if you're in a party of if you're in a random group of 65 people who don't organize and actually kick the barrel towards it and instead kick it to your party, it could be the worst dungeon in the game. But I enjoy how the boss is just a stationary entity that you have to try to take out by exploiting a mechanic in the dungeon itself. The drops are great. You get a mana potion. Mana potions are not as sought after as the likes of the life potion, but you also get 20 fame, and if you go through a full clear, that can be 35, maybe 40 fame, and fame is good. And the white bags are fitting for its difficulty. The Tome of Pain sucks, but the Recurring Terror spell and the Scepter of Devastation are great. Not to mention it drops 2 of the 4 pieces of the Symbiotic Ripper guy or whatever, the host. What is the actual name of that set supposed to be? I just call it the Ripper set. And that's why I put it alongside Crawling Depths, because the overall drops that you can get from this dungeon are quite appropriate for the difficulty. And I would never pass up an opportunity to go into a Parasite Chamber for that very reason. Forbidden Jungle... Okay. I'll put it here just because I love the design of the jungle more than I like, for instance, the Forest Maze. But at the same time, while it does yield slightly more rewarding drops, especially if you're playing a Necromancer, than the likes of a Pirate Cave and a Forest Maze, the fact that you have to kind of blindly search for one, especially if you're trying to complete the Tunnel Rat Fame bonus, is what makes this dungeon more annoying than it is sought after. So I don't have much to say about it. I have kind of the same sentiment for like all the earlier dungeons, in that it's just, even when you're a new player, Forbidden Jungle is not that great to go into. I would only go into it if I'm playing like a PvE class that has a staff, but otherwise not so much. Okay, you guys might be hearing some landscaping going on in the background. I do apologize for that. I hope it's not too overbearing, but if it is, then I apologize in advance. Sprite World. It has kind of the same properties as an Undead Lair, where it's easy to go through, and the rewards it gives you are appropriate for the difficulty. Dex is a very valuable stat to max, and it's also the most accessible stat to max. Limon the Sprite Goddess is not the most entertaining boss to fight, but she's not that oppressive either. You know, you just gotta wait for her to stop spinning around in places and then wait for her to stand in the middle, and then you go and get your damage in. Cloak of the Planewalker is a very good white. Staff of Extreme Prejudice is terrible, obviously, but it's intended to be terrible. I don't play a rogue, so I don't care about Planewalker, but Sprite World is just so unimposing of a dungeon that I think it's perfectly fine to have it as, like, you know, for the rewards it gives, I think it's nice. And I do love the rotating conveyor belts and all that stuff, and how like you're in space and the colors. I can't wait to see what the epic version of this dungeon would be, if it's ever made. When I first started playing Realm, I actually thought you could fall off the world in this dungeon, and so I'd be super careful not to like accidentally fall off, which was a good memory. So I'm placing it high up just because of sentimental value, and it was, you know, it is one of the first dungeons people go to because of how plentiful it is. Ice Cave. I'll put it above Puppet Theater, but below Mad Lab. It can give you a source of, I think, mana and dex, and the white bags are okay. The skull and ring are good, the robe and staff are bad. I love the change they did. The old Ice Cave was awful. It was just the most tedious thing to go through, but the new Ice Cave I think is awesome. How you have like 2 spawning platforms and you work your way towards the middle, you take out all the big enemies, and there you go. The boss fight for Esben is another example of invulnerability phases meant purely to stall for time. Esben going invulnerable and requiring you to take out those like spires or those like creepy dark spirit image mirror monster, whatever they're called. That's not really a threat. It's not something that you feel inclined to complete as soon as possible lest you die. It's just there to make it so that you can't insta the boss. And that's what prevents this dungeon from being higher up, is just because of the boss fight being pretty poorly designed. But I love the changes they made to the dungeon you have to go through before the boss room. So I'll put it up higher there. Ice Tomb. Put it mid C tier, mid to low C tier. It's a more annoying tomb that gives, ironically, less drops. So that's all I have to say about it. There might be some people who bring up the argument that the reason why Ice Tomb could be better than regular ones is because you don't have to go through the tiresome effort of going through and getting all the Sarks, but the sarcophagi can drop potions themselves along with the T-Sarks. And honestly, I would rather much take the quicksand in regular Tomb of the Ancients than the sliding ice in Ice Tomb, just because at least in like in a Tomb of the Ancients you have quote-unquote safe spots you can retreat to, whereas in Ice Tomb, if you're not careful, you're just gonna get blasted. There's nothing you can do. Plus, you know, they happen too infrequently for me to like actually draw a closer, I guess, assessment of it. So I'll put it C tier, like mid to low C tier. D-Docks, S tier. A, once again, very threatening dungeon if you don't know that you can simply just outrun the hordes of pirates chasing after you relentlessly. Gives you great chances for loot, a guaranteed treasure room that's not that hard to find. And, you know, especially if you have a loot clover potion, you can very easily get like 5 potions from this one dungeon. It has the same properties of a cemetery where it has Actually, I'm gonna put this above Cemetery. It may not give as many potions as the likes of the Cemetery, but the white bags are both quite good. And the Pirate King set, the ST set for the Pirate King is also great. I believe from this dungeon you can get the Tricorn and the First Mate's Hook. People meme on the First Mate's Hook for being completely terrible, but the Tricorn, not bad. And the Pirate King set is phenomenal. You also can get life pots from this dungeon too, which is probably what puts it a lot higher. But the two white bags, Wavecrest Concertina and the Pirate King Cutlass, both are top tier. So therefore, I put it as S tier because I like this dungeon a lot. It's short and sweet, very rewarding, and if you don't know how to run the dungeon, you are going to die.